Welcome to today's video on the social effects of the Industrial Revolution. So we've spent some time on the causes, now we're doing some effects. So your left side for today is going to be a web organizer. I'll show you an example in a second of what that can look like. So you can pause it and copy it or just make your own version as you go along. But first I want to provide you with a disclaimer. There are stick figures in this PowerPoint and unfortunate events. In no way do I think these events were really good or comical or in any way do I endorse stick figures getting maimed. Okay, so here's an example of a web organizer you can make on the left. And of course it doesn't need to look exactly like this, but just so you know, you're just sort of make your own bubbles of your notes as we go through the information for today. So either pause this and copy it, or like I said, make your own as you go along. So the first thing we're going to discuss is something we've talked a little bit in class, is how cities were growing very rapidly. As in England, for example, people were moving out of the agricultural areas into the urban areas. But the cities were not able to keep up with the pace of this mass migration. So they didn't have things like sanitary codes or building safety codes or all those laws to protect people. So as a result, they were pretty much filthy and dangerous and crowded. Houses, most of them had no running water, and most of them had no toilets. An example is that in Manchester in England, in the 1850s, there were only 2 toilets outdoors for every 250 people. And when I say toilets, they were really just tubs that people had to empty at the end of the day. So housing conditions like this was the perfect breeding grounds for disease. And here's some examples of how many people were killed by diseases like typhus, smallpox, and dysentery. This is in London alone in just 1832. Over 31,000 people. That's incredible. Another example, in London, between 1831 and 1832, 7,000 people alone died from cholera, and 15,000 people died from it between 1848 and 1849. And in fact, tuberculosis accounted for 1/3 of all deaths in England between 1800 and 1850. Right? So not good. And that's mostly because of sewage leaking into drinking water. And due to the hard times quote we had in class the other day, we already learned a little bit about pollution covering the cities. And when you had things like smoke blocking out the light, it actually is dangerous. And there was a high increase of children suffering from rickets because they didn't have vitamin D. So another effect is that they didn't have enough police with all these people in the cities at first, so crime rose and actually led to the increase in mafias to protect people where police didn't. Whole families often lived in one room. This picture, and along with a few others, are actually from the Tenement Museum, which is in New York City. So tenements were the type of apartments that many people lived in. So you just see some examples of basically one room, maybe 2 rooms, sometimes even 4 rooms, but if you had that many, you still had a lot more people than we did, even though family sizes did start to decrease with industrialization. So you see how furniture even played dual purposes. A couch would be a bed, a table would be a closet. And when people would get up to work in the factories, usually people would come home from the factories and sleep in those beds. They call those hotbeds. So the average worker worked about 14-hour days, 6 days a week. Here's an example of a cotton factory. Each mill usually employed hundreds of people. The factories were dangerous, and I think we discussed this a little bit in class. People didn't have health insurance back then. You couldn't, sue your employer if you were hurt, and injuries were very common. If you look at this PowerPoint in the barn, this is actually animated. See what happens to the stick figure there. Children often left school to go to work, and it wasn't, in England, it wasn't until the 1830s where there were laws that said, hey, no children under 9 could work. But 9 years old, hey, you don't need to go to school, you could go to work even then. The children often supported their families, especially if their parents were hurt on the job. And mill owners often took orphans, because, hey, you don't need to pay orphans because they're technically your children. How convenient. And things were dangerous for children. These machines didn't have safety, they didn't wear safety goggles. The machines were dangerous, and they often fell asleep and also, got hurt by machines and all those sorts of things. Don't worry about that. That was a little mistake. So we're going to learn a little bit more about child labor and read some examples later. The password today is tuberculosis. See if you can figure out how to spell tuberculosis. All right, we'll see you next class. Make sure you have this ready, and see you then.